Good evening, and welcome to the Royal Aeronautical Society's Wilbur and Orville Wright Lecture for 2023. I'm very pleased that so many of you can join us this evening. I'm Carissa Khan, President of the Royal Aeronautical Society. The Wilbur and Orville Wright Lecture is a key event for the Royal Aeronautical Society and was established to honour the pioneers of flight who completed the first successful controlled powered flight on the 17th of December 1903. 2023, of course, marks 120 years since that very first flight. And on this important anniversary, I'm pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Air Marshal Johnny Stringer, Deputy Commander NATO Air Command, to share his thoughts on contemporary thoughts on European air power. 30 years on from the end of the Cold War, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has changed strategic, political, and military realities in Europe. In this lecture, the implications for the now and next of European air power will be discussed, as well as the key areas that offer both challenge and opportunity for nations and the NATO alliance. Air Marshal Johnny Stringer from the Royal Air Force has been the Deputy Commander of NATO's Allied Air Command, headquartered at Ramstein Air Base, Germany, since August 2022. A qualified weapon instructor, he flew operationally over the former Yugoslavia and helped enforce the northern Iraq no-fly zone. His staff experience at squadron leader and wing commander included tours in the RAeS Fast Jet Group headquarters and in the Ministry of Defense on future combat air capability. From 2007 to 2009, Johnny commanded 29th Squadron, the Typhoon Operational Conversion Unit at RAF Coningsby. Leaving on promotion, he spent 2 years as Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff, Joint Effects in the J3 Division of the UK Permanent Joint Headquarters at Northwood. Between October 2012 and September 2014, Johnny commanded RAF Coningsby and its Typhoon Wing, supporting national and overseas Typhoon operations, and displayed the Spitfire and Hurricane with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. He was posted as Assistant Chief of Staff Operations to Headquarters Air Command in August 2015, before commanding No. 83 Expeditionary Air Group as a UK Air Component Commander between October 2016 and October 2017, in charge of all national air operations in the fight against Daesh, in Operation Shader and across the region. Promoted to Air Vice Marshal, Johnny was Chief of Staff at UK Joint Forces Command and subsequently Director of Strategy at GFC, as GFC evolved into UK Strategic Command, overseeing its work on the 2021 UK Defence and Security Integrated Review. I would also like to thank Lockheed Martin for sponsoring this lecture. This support allows the Society to continue to run free lectures which are open to all, both members and non-members. I'm pleased that we are joined this evening by Kelvin Truss, Head of Strategic Engagement at Lockheed Martin UK, who will say a few words at the end of the lecture. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements. So there will not be a fire alarm test in the building today. Therefore, if the alarm goes off, then please exit the building. The Society's staff, the Society's designated assembly point is the paved and railed area at the junction of Hamilton Place and Piccadilly, beyond the Intercontinental Hotel. RAeS staff will be on hand to guide you. If you have mobility or access issues, please make yourself known to a member of the event staff so that they can make necessary arrangements for your safe exit from the building in case of an emergency. Please do not leave unmarked bags or any items unattended. Mobile phones are to be switched off during the session, please. And after the presentation, there will be for questions. Please step up to the mic if you have a question. We'll have some roving mics later on. And finally, you're all invited to join us afterwards for a networking drinks reception at 2100 in the Argyle Room on the first floor. Now, without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Air Marshal Johnny Stringer to the stage. Thank you.
Carissa, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. It really is a great pleasure and privilege to be invited to give this year's Wilbur Orville Wright Lecture, as you said, 120 years after that genuinely groundbreaking, indeed ground leaving, first powered flight at Kitty Hawk. The Wright brothers connect not one but two of my great passions or themes for and through much of my life: aviation and also the humble bicycle. It's still just about acceptable to be both a recovering fast jet pilot and a mammal, or middle-aged man in lycra. It is a truism that throughout those last 120 years, airspace has continually moved forwards and upwards. And throughout that period, unsurprisingly, that has also been true of military aviation. If I shamelessly connect some of my own flying background and aircraft flown to that first powered flight, there are 33 years between the first flights of the Wright Flyer and the Spitfire in 1936, with 12 horsepower rising to just under 1,000 horsepower. 32 years later, the first flight of the Sepicat Jaguar in 1968, with 16,000 pounds of thrust, and then a little under another 30 years to the inaugural Eurofighter Typhoon flight in 1994 and 40,000 pounds of thrust. Today, air forces across Europe are equipping with fourth and fifth generation fast jets, increasingly capable and complex intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, or ISR aircraft, sophisticated standoff precision weapons, and an array of uncrewed systems. So far then, so good. The last 120 years has also seen profound geostrategic and geopolitical change. As the Wright brothers prepared for their first flight, exactly 1 month earlier, on the 17th of November 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party split into two groups: the Bolsheviks, Russian for majority, and the Mensheviks, or the minority, and we know where that ended up. The last 30 years are bookended by the end of the Cold War and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the terrorist attacks of 9/11 generating their own political, ideological, and military vector. As I set out some personal insights on European air power over the next 30 or so minutes, let me offer that two long shadows from 30 years inform my analysis. The first is that thrown by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of an existential threat to Europe and the North Atlantic, and the perceived enduring triumph of liberal democracy. The second, and slightly shorter shadow, is what I would see as the one provided by the COIN years, 20 plus years of counterinsurgency operations where airspace and the electromagnetic spectrum were uncontested free goods, and air was almost always seen as a supporting element to the land component. Both have impacted on the moral, physical, and conceptual components of NATO's air forces and way in air warfare. We have seen over the last decade or so the democratization of previous high-end and expensive technologies. Just about anyone can access precision navigation and timing, beyond line-of-sight secure comms and data, and drones and other uncrewed systems are now at least as much weapons as platforms. And you can be active participants in the cyber domain with a laptop and an internet connection. Any smartphone incorporates or can access much of this. But some of these technologies, including most obviously stealth and precision standoff, have also become effectively democratized. In 10 years or so, well over 600 F-35s will be operated in Europe, only 54 of them by the United States Air Force. This offers great opportunity for Europe's air forces, no matter what they operate. So I'm both heartened and confident that NATO has, under the banner of deterrence and defence of the North Atlantic area, a family of plans that provide the necessary framework for maintaining security on the European continent. At their core are credible and executable ways and means of defending NATO nations and the organisation of forces across all domains that would deliver this. It won't surprise this audience that air and space power have a key role in our enduring deterrent posture and, if we ever have to, in defeating any adversary. The conflict in Ukraine has highlighted and reinforced some central tenets of our way in warfare, starting most obviously with the necessity for control of the air. Neither Russia nor Ukraine has been able to achieve it at a level approaching the air superiority and air supremacy that Western nations have taken for granted for decades. However, I think we need to rethink how we achieve or secure access to the air domain, and that it may well be far more geographically and temporally bounded, certainly at the start of any campaign, than we have considered previously. This will impact on how we conduct activity across all domains. The air component will almost certainly be in the lead in providing freedom of access and manoeuvre for our land and naval forces, the traditional three domains. And it will also need to be integrated with them to an extent of which we have achieved it episodically in the past, but which will now need to be our default. Some of you, perhaps most of you, will know what the picture is here. This is the Ukrainians dealing a pretty mortal blow to an S-400 system in Crimea. I'll take two obvious examples then, but these are not the only ones, that pull these strands together. The first is the need to defeat our opponents' anti-access and area denial areas, A2AD for short, and thus not just their surface-to-air missile systems, but their long-range anti-shipping cruise missiles and surface-to-surface missile and rocket systems, so what we collectively call the counter-A2AD mission. And our adversaries and competitors have spent decades developing their own way in warfare to blunt ours. So it stands to reason that successfully prosecuting that counter-A2AD mission will set the conditions for successful NATO defence. To do this effectively requires exceptional integration of assets and effects from all five of the domains, so including cyber and space, and sophisticated synchronization in time and space. It is challenging but essential, and we are putting considerable conceptual and practical effort into being as good at this as we can be. Indeed, we held the first ever NATO Air Command Weapons and Tactics Conference in Ramstein this July to study both this mission and our second key one, Integrated Air and Missile Defence, or IMD. If I'd been speaking at a similar gathering even 10 years ago, mention of IAMD would have probably generated mental images of fighter against fighter air combat, batteries of surface-to-air missile systems, and defeating the threat posed by heavy bombers with standoff weapons. All these aspects remain, of course, but the breadth of threats that we must now protect against encompasses weaponized drones at one end of the spectrum, costing a few $100s, euros or pounds, to hypersonic air-launched ballistic missiles at the other. The differentiation between air and missile defence and ballistic missile defence is becoming increasingly blurred too, with some defensive systems having capability across that range of threats. It's also fair to say that we have not maintained the investment in our IAMD capabilities that was a hallmark of the Cold War, and we need to reverse this. And the reason I put up the slide just now, this is the Combined Air Operations Centre in Al Udeid, can house up to 700 people. It is, in a way, a product of much of our thinking of the last 30 years or so. And please hold this mental image as I talk a little bit about command and control later. So, although what I'm about to set out might not be doctrinally pure, I see four pillars of IAMD. Firstly, the necessary capabilities in our sensors and our shooters. And of those, if you invest in anything first off, you put it into your sensors, because if you can't understand through seeing stuff, you can't then act. Secondly, the right architecture across our command and control network to ensure we exploit what we're seeing and what we can affect. Thirdly, the posture of our assets to ensure they are in the right places and at required readiness. And finally, the authorities and permissions with which to operate. The slide behind me, as hopefully you can just about see, is actually obviously a different geographical area for NATO in the mid-60s, but this is effectively the sort of Nike Hercules and Hawk missile batteries ranged from the sort of Denmark right down to south of the then West Germany. We had a lot of stuff. Of note, the current Sakir's father was a Hawk missile battery commander a few decades ago in Central Europe. I'm sure he had stuff passed down from father to son. It is chastening to note that unclassified figures show that Ukraine has expended thousands of SAMs of many types against Russian standoff weapons and drones. Indeed, an open source figure this afternoon I was just looking up before coming here showed that in the first 3 months of the conflict in Ukraine, over 2,000 cruise missiles and similar were launched by the Russians against the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians have fired many thousands of SAMs and many hundreds of thousands of anti-aircraft artillery rounds. And to borrow a phrase from a few years back, you can't only go against the arrows, you need to take on the archer too. This shouldn't be a surprise. Offensive counter-air as well as defensive counter-air has been a staple of Air Force's doctrine from almost the outset of air warfare. You can probably see too how the counter A2AD and the IAMD missions are complementary and mutually reinforcing. What it does also highlight is the need to ensure that we have the right deep precision strike capabilities too. And this is a 15E releasing a JASM extended range standoff weapon. In the first few months of the war in Ukraine, it was perhaps surprising to see how commentary was focused on the close battle to almost the exclusion of anything else. For some, I sense there was something approaching comfort in their certainty that we were returning to the classic land battle and artillery exchanges consuming millions of 155mm artillery rounds. Images from the front line were redolent of 1917, not 2022. But as I mentioned earlier, many commentators, I think, didn't comprehend that the failures to achieve air superiority and an inability to interdict supply lines, and on the Russian side, the abject failure to execute meaningful joint warfare, condemned and has condemned both sides to an attritional, bloody struggle. As a defensive alliance, NATO will rightly always be reactive in any conflict in Europe. What that does, however, is to place, for me, a premium on the need for rapidity and effectiveness in response. It is no surprise that there has been considerable investment in precision standoff weapons in all three traditional domains and the cyber and space support that goes with them. And innovation in weapon employment increases weapon survivability against even advanced defensive systems, as we have again seen in Ukraine. This increased effectiveness is in itself a means of enhancing mass. It also underlines the importance of investment in systems to ensure we compete in and exploit the electromagnetic environment. Again, an area that saw a lack of investment during the COIN years, rooted in the EM spectrum itself being another one of those uncontested free goods, much like space. picture behind me is of a Russian tent electronic warfare system, of which they have many. Done right, this is both effective deterrence in its own right, the ability to hold at risk much of what an adversary holds dear, and it also ensures that we play to our own strengths and craft the operational design to execute it if ever necessary. It is worth noting at this point how the language surrounding air power and its employment needs to change as well. A staple of the COIN years that still endures is that air forces and air power enable other components and domains. A somewhat passive term, enablement, it implies a sense of being supporting rather than decisive, potentially in its own right, and also perhaps a sense of it being optional. Well, imagine warfighting and campaigning without it. To me, air power doesn't just enable, it allows. For example, essential joint force freedom of manoeuvre and access, and it also amplifies the contribution and effectiveness of the other domains. And its inherent speed and agility compresses time, speed and distance like not much else, whilst enhancing options and choice. So, back to the physical component of air fighting power. What, for example, might all this mean for capability development and investment decisions? I noted earlier the significant number of F-35s that will be in Europe over the next decade, but there will also be many more fourth-generation platforms than fifth-gen. The recent recapitalisation in ISR, in airlift and tankers is very welcome, albeit against an ever-increasing demand signal. But it thus follows that much of what we see in European skies and in the orders of battle of European air forces now and in the near future will be there for decades to come. It is in very large part the force within the air component that NATO will be relying upon. So I think that where we will need to invest development and procurement money is also in the things that enhance those platforms. Sensor development, either on or off board, affordable and precise enough munitions, and the command and control capability that from strategic to tactical and across domains allows us to genuinely achieve decision superiority at necessary speed, rather than put it on a PowerPoint slide and hope that it magically occurs. This will draw on digital development at pace and against timelines that are far more akin to the commercial sector than has traditionally been the case in defence. Having spent some time with the tech startup before my current post, I'm not sure that we have yet fully realised this, let alone embraced it. It is another powerful driver, too, for us to reset our attitudes towards risk, operational, in R&D, and in procurement, to allow us to seize opportunities and to be genuinely innovative, an approach that I believe the Wright brothers would have intuitively understood and applied. Some of the capabilities we require could also be bought more imaginatively too. One nation might not be able to afford an EW platform, but several combining together could. A nation without fast jets could still contribute air-launched weapons and decoys to the overall stockpile, and the picture behind me is of a B-52 carrying miniature air-launched decoys or MALDs. And not everything, either, needs to be done or should be done at 31, i.e. as a full NATO project across all 31 nations. Touch wood, soon to be 32 with Sweden. We are seeing this already in things such as the European Sky Shield initiative to enhance our surface-based air and missile defence. We should also look at how we might use what we've got in more novel ways. Now, I didn't actually select this slide for one particular member of the audience, but we may have worked on this project together 20 years ago. This is slides from the then Future Offensive Air System programme, and a very callow squadron leader Stringer in his first staff tour in London. Much of what we were doing across uncrewed systems, weapons, and overall deep strike capability was ahead of its time, and it didn't fit with the political and military priorities of 03-04, themselves driven by the then strategic context. One of those elements was using airlifters for multiple standoff weapons release. The UK parked its work on this, whilst the USAF now fields the Rapid Dragon palletised launch system for aircraft such as the C-130 and the C-17. Amongst other things, this is another means of enhancing mass and providing commanders with options. But excellent concepts and leading-edge equipment are, of course, for nothing without talented and imaginative leadership in their employment. Accordingly, we will need to focus on our people and provide training and, most importantly, education that ensures our people excel from cockpit to command. The recent death of the first RAF Director of Defence Studies, the wonderful and inspiring Tony Mason, had some of us reading his note to the Air Force Board in the UK over 30 years ago on the selection of senior commanders. I commend it to you, whether in the military or not, as a superb piece of analysis and writing with continued relevance. Amongst many attributes, Tony identified the need for intellectual depth, professional curiosity, and the benefits of interests alongside but beyond the tactical business of the Air Force. After almost 20 years of supporting the land component in counterinsurgency campaigns, we must ensure that we are developing the necessary mental agility and campaigning mentality in our Air Force's senior operational commanders. This is but one of the factors that will determine the future developmental path of command and control in the air domain. And again, here I believe we can set out some foundational elements. Our operating system will need to be akin to that of an iPhone, with us adapting an app-like approach to ensure we have the most effective and intuitive software with which to understand, then orchestrate and execute increasingly demanding missions integrated across all domains. For reasons of survivability, resilience and redundancy, we're likely to use multiple operating locations to prevent a central, single centre being targeted. Nor is it far-fetched to imagine small teams distributed across Europe, connected by 5G or satellite networks and operating from distinctly unmilitary locations. Think Starlink and Starbucks. Of course, other satellite operators and coffee companies are available. For air forces that have practiced increasingly centralised planning and oversight of execution, this will be quite a change. Accordingly, our view of permissions and the delegation of authorities will need to change too. There has been a consistent sense of, over at least the last decade, of decisions being removed from pilots and tactical crews, with a reversion to the CAOC for approvals, due largely to the luxury of time, lack of threat, and preponderance of ISR. We won't have this luxury if we ever have to fight at scale and tempo, and we need to inculcate a different mindset from the political policy level and through the strategic, operational, and tactical. Be still my beating heart. If I think back to joining the front line in late 1993 at RAF Coltishall on the Jaguar Force and the 3 consecutive tours and a weapons instructor course that followed, I think that I was exceptionally fortunate in my timing. The RAF was post-Cold War, absorbing lessons from a still recent Gulf War I, evolving tactics, including getting properly into sophisticated night operations across all forces. Plenty of operational and exercise deployments too, with the former Yugoslavia and northern and southern Iraq no-fly zones, the obvious but certainly not the only examples. Whilst a sense of purpose and professionalism was never in doubt, it was also fun. We ask much of our current aircrew, whilst perhaps unconsciously forgetting that they are the tip of an Air Force's spear, carrying responsibilities and liabilities beyond most of their fellow servicemen and women. This is no bid for exceptionalism, although they are a pretty exceptional bunch. But I think we need to get some better balance back here. And despite the professionalism and seriousness of their duties, a little more fun back too. What we have also seen across NATO in the last 2 years is a requirement to think through these changes in the time afforded us and informed by that very different context from the 24th of February last year. This should include ensuring any battle space is orientated along the most operationally effective lines, that our rules of engagement have been thought through at 1G to ensure they provide robust permissions at 9G, that our logistics supply chains are effective in use, offer redundancy and are proofed against cyber malfeasance, and that all are tested as part of how we operate when our comms and connectivity is degraded. Many in this audience will also know better than I what we will need to do to expand the industrial base at pace. We might also reflect on what we buy that enhances operational effectiveness through genuine interoperability. Our air forces now operate and employ a remarkably diverse array of platforms and weapons. Might we need to simplify some of this to better optimize operational output? We also need to ensure that we get back to increasing the survivability and resilience of our forces and the means to sustain and command them. I was in Finland last week to see the Finnish Air Force's approach from infrastructure to operational planning, and it is mightily impressive. It also reflects that we will need an array of approaches across European air forces, as one size here will not fit all. But it will require both investment and organisational change to make it a reality. NATO Air Command is cohering approaches across nations, including reinvigorating the aircraft cross-servicing and standardisation agreements that were once commonplace but have atrophied somewhat over the last 30 years. I suspect some in this audience will be reminiscing happily about ample gain trips to overseas bases or to the delights of field sites near the old inner German border. Some might be flinching or showing nervous tics at the memory of minivals, maxivals and tachyvals. What we are focused on with Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE and our sister theatre component commands is ensuring we use exercises as a means of experimentation and innovation, as well as validation and certification. The recent Steadfast Jupiter exercise was an important step on this path, but I also see more imaginative use of tabletop exercises and simulation to address specific areas. I would also point to the inaugural Ramstein flag exercise to be held in Greece in October next year, where we will test and assess multiple training objectives using very large force employment across some of our most demanding missions. I've attempted then in the sort of last 35 minutes or so to provide some personal observations on the status of European air power. I've not mentioned space in any great detail, as time has largely precluded this, but rest assured that enhancing NATO's capabilities in this key domain is high on the list of priorities. The Ukraine conflict has had a catalytic effect, as one might expect, and the mix of commercial and military platforms and providers offers an array of choice. We are going to have to work hard to ensure we retain our access to space, and this includes the ability to counter our opponent's space capabilities. Having consistent high-fidelity space domain awareness underpins much else, and this remains a key task for us at Ramstein, which is also the home of NATO's space component. I would also highlight here the very close cooperation we enjoy with NATO nations' own space commands and components, and this will only deepen over the coming months and years. If I pull together the key strands of what I've just set out, it won't surprise you that alongside delivering our standing tasks as Aircom, these form the Commander's 5 key priorities. The 2 missions of Counter A2AD and Integrated Air and Missile Defence, the future Air C2 in all forms to operate and succeed in an increasingly complex and multi-domain context, information sharing that underpins the most effective understanding and decision-making, and an agile combat employment posture that helps protect people and platforms whilst confusing opponents. Underpinning these are effects integration and synchronization, experimentation and innovation, and a leading role across NATO as it develops its multi-domain operations concept. We are restructuring the headquarters at Ramstein to better support this, including enhanced C2, planning and warfighting development elements. Back to the Wright brothers. Whilst we rightly celebrate and commemorate the first powered heavier-than-air flight, to me, the critical part of success at Kitty Hawk was understanding the need for control in 3 axes, the ability to pitch, roll and yaw, and thus achieve the fundamentals of controlled flight. We face considerable turbulence right now as we seek to maintain the equivalent of controlled flight at the operational and strategic levels. And I think we're in for an unstable and unpredictable decade or more. It will need imagination, education, engagement, commitment and confidence as we navigate through it, and the will and resolve across nations and our populations to see us through. European air forces have been, are now, and will continue to be central to this collective and essential endeavour. Thank you very much to the Royal Aeronautical Society once again for the opportunity to deliver this year's Wilbur Orville Wright Lecture, and I would be delighted to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.